Thank you so much for inviting me. This has been a really enjoyable weekend so far. And it's been really enjoyable to prepare this talk because the audience here, like the people here, are so different from the people who I normally talk to about these things. I talk to scientists a lot. I talk to more analytic philosophers a lot. And I think the general perspective of people here is quite different. And these slides have changed a lot over the course of the weekend, especially some conversation with Sean and Johannes early on in the conference really influenced how I wanted to present these ideas. So I started out wanting to talk about this idea, science, technology, and the pursuit of stability, this idea that science and technology are part of this stabilizing process, this thing that started with biology, with homeostasis, and comes through in our cultural practices and in our practice of science and of tool making. But actually, I, in the course of preparing this talk, got a lot more familiar and a lot more empathetic with people who are concerned about the prospect of immortality. And what I saw there was what I would term sort of an anxiety over immortality. Not necessarily a specific worry about what it would be like to be an immortal human, but a generalized feeling of angst or dread about the prospect is sort of similar, I mean, to the angst and dread that existentialists feel about life, generally speaking. It's just more of it. And so, for further reading on life extension and enhancement generally, and much more detailed argumentation and treatment of these issues, I highly recommend this volume. It's been a really excellent read, but the experience, the article that most shaped what I wanted to talk about was actually by a sort of an opponent of immortality, Leon Kass, and his article, L'Chaim and Its Limits, Why Not Immortality? I had this great feeling reading it of him coming to find me and meet me and like explain himself, this person who has very alien views to mine. He doesn't seem to want to live for a really long time the way I do. And so what I wanted to do was try to give a similar gift in this talk of trying to come and find you and explain why I think the things I do about this. And so this talk is less about argumentation, less about me trying to persuade you of some particular view, and more of trying to explain the preconditions, like the emotional state and the sort of experience that leads me to value very long and healthy life, and to not be very anxious about immortality. So the goal here for me is to know ourselves better and to speak openly to one another. It's sort of a Christmas in the trenches, like trying to come across and explain the commonalities that we have. So I'll set aside some worries for this talk. I think there are big worries and good things to talk about around justice, distributive justice of healthcare technology. Like if there were people who could live indefinitely through preventing their aging or through curing the symptoms of aging, it would almost certainly be unevenly distributed over the world when it's first developed, and maybe for an indefinite period after that. And that would be a great injustice. There are similar injustices in the distribution of medical care today, and I think those are maybe more important to think about than the theoretical injustice of the distribution of immortality. But I'm setting that aside for this talk, and I'm setting aside practical social or societal impacts. So like questions about population size, questions about will we fill up the planet, will we be able to reproduce, like what's the relationship to in order to have kids, will we need to kill the elderly, essentially, if people have the potential to live forever? So what I'm going to be thinking about instead is this impact on the self and impact on the flourishing and welfare of the individual under the condition of immortality. So just for context, what we're talking about here is not it's not really immortality in like the sense that maybe it's imagined in religion or the sense that it's maybe imagined in more abstract philosophy, but the idea of extending healthy life. So there's sort of the mundane extension of healthy life. This is a lot of what we're doing now. We're curing or trying to find treatments and cures for heart disease, for cancer, for strokes, for Alzheimer's. As we continue extending people's lives, we encounter these sort of new obstacles that come up at greater and greater ages. Then there's weirder stuff. Well, not as weird as the bottom line, but this idea of a general cure for aging. So some kinds of treatments that could fix cellular damage that builds up over time and causes generalized aging symptoms. There's the idea of lengthening the telomeres, the structures in the cell that regulate how many times a cell may divide in order to replenish your tissues as cells die. Both of those are pretty contentious in the medical community. They're not established science. But they're things that people are working on with the explicit goal of extending healthy human life, not of taking the period between, say, 90 and 100 and extending that by 40 years, but taking maybe your 20s, 30s, 40s and extending that healthy, vibrant period. And then the third line, which I'm quite interested in, but we won't have time to get deeply into today, is the idea that we could significantly replace parts of our bodies or change the vessels that we live in a way that could extend our lives much more radically. So the idea of replacing parts of humans with machines, or even this idea, so I don't like the term uploading much. I think it is sort of glib and like skips over what's philosophically interesting about the idea of taking the functional structures of your mind and migrating. You can think of packing your bags in your brain and taking them to a new apartment. Like another word might be transcription. So like taking something from one medium or one language and moving it to another, where that thing is the self instead of some work or some artifact. Or you could think of a wave that propagates from one medium into another medium, but the properties of the wave are maintained. So these are prospects for, in that first row we have like maybe people like us will live to be 110 or 120. In the second row, there's a hope of living much longer, maybe living to your 200s or something. And the third row is where we get this hope of really moving into geological time as individuals, or moving into historical time. Which we currently don't experience much of the sweep of history in like our short lives. So another thing that's interesting here is that I think the people who are most serious about the extension of healthy life are not really thinking about immortality. Like for the most part, they don't think that human life could be extended indefinitely. Like our best scientific theories of the universe don't say that you can continue forever. It would take a real sort of like left field occurrence for us to find out that we could keep doing things forever, given like the heat death of the universe. But to a human, long life looks a lot like immortality. I mean, it's just a truism that when you're young, you don't really believe in your own mortality because it's so distant, and it would even be more so for very long life. There's also this funny property that in between the ephemeral and the eternal, there are very, very large numbers, and thinking about those numbers sort of expands the mental space that you have between the finite and the infinite. Infinity is such a smooth concept. It's something that you feel like you can just hold. But big numbers are hairy and messy and really, really large. So a few birthdays that you might consider if you lived a long time, a really rough back-of-the-envelope calculation, if you didn't die from natural causes, from aging or from common diseases, then you might expect to live 1,700 years. This would be like the average life expectancy. And so that's like living since the First Council of Nicaea. That's a pretty long time. Already, I feel like I can't psychologically grasp this number. Like that's just really, really large. The equivalent of someone who lives 100 years now, like if you're on that long-lived end of the distribution, now is living for 11,000 years. So living since the Neolithic, you would have been around for the domestication of wheat, sheep, and goats, so you would have seen a lot of change in your lifetime. And this is like, if the 1700 years was hard to wrap your head around, then 11,000 years is quite a bit harder. And then just to show sort of how far we can go, there are these years around physical events in the universe. So 1,000 trillion years, stars grow dim, we're left with dwarf stars, we're left with black holes, like the world looks radically different. 1,000 trillion years, protons have decayed. Like, we have no more matter that everything we interact with is made of. We enter what is called the black hole era. All we have left are black holes floating around in the void. Maybe humans will figure out how to do something with that. It's not really clear. And this isn't even really, if a mathematician were here, this isn't really getting into big numbers at all. Even though before I got up here, I had a sort of a worry that I'd misplaced some of my trillions here, but it doesn't really matter. Like, we just aren't equipped to deal with this. Another caveat here is that at this point, I think that a lot of your personal mortality risk would come from the risk of human extinction. I think that that's a really serious thing and a topic I'd be happy to talk about later, but not the topic of this talk. So as I've been reading about this, I kind of want to paint these, in the project I was talking about earlier of trying to come together and like reveal to each other where we're coming from. I have these imaginary camps of immortalists and mortalists. So immortalists being people who really can't see why they would want the end of healthy life. They'd want one day more and one day more. And mortalists saying, like, no, wait, let's think about this. This is something that we've never lived with before. Let's like really seriously consider what that could be like. You might think, I think it's easy for the camps to view each other in not very flattering ways. So immortalists are naive, they're optimistic, they're simplistic, maybe they're young people, which is sort of ironic, like that young people might be more gung-ho about life extension than older people who are, closer to the deadline. But sort of this idea that you're not thinking very deeply about the world if you're an immortalist. Whereas maybe mortalists appear sort of world-weary, pessimistic, overly elaborate, like you have to find a way to say something interesting, and it's not very interesting to say that longer, healthier life is good. Like, you're not going to get tenure for that. But I think it's important to move past these. I think these are real pictures, and I think it's good to poke fun at these pictures because, like, I can see myself in here. Like, I'm 29. But I think that there's truth in both of these, or there's like real experience, there's real perspective and meaningful engagement with this on both sides of the equation. So the immortalist argument is sort of embarrassingly simple, just that healthy life is usually good. And something that I think immortalists fall back to infrequently on is the idea that choice is good. So like giving people the choice of having a long and healthy life, and then if they choose to take another path, if they choose to end their life, that's fine too. We've offered the choice. And then there's the basic, like, this is not like a real school of thought, it's just a useful phrase, but the basic techno-immortalist mindset is just that healthy life is a precondition for flourishing, and that technology can promote a healthy life, and then you're done. Like the train of thought, even if this is like, I think for a lot of people who are interested in life extension, this argument is never even made explicit. It's just like a natural way of thinking about the world, that we have these tools, we can use them to promote flourishing of humans. And of course, like, we could refer to Bacon, we could go back and start talking about how there's historical precedent and the soil is like rich in this area. But I think that's something that you can probably fill in. So the mortalist picture, I'm trying my best here because this is not like a very natural view for me. But the mortalist pictures that I've been able to pick up are first that maybe life isn't as good as you think. Especially as it continues, it may grow less and less interesting over time. That the prospect of death has benefits or makes us human. This is something that I hadn't really thought deeply about, and that I'm really glad that I had the chance to read more about, because specifically people arguing not that death itself is good, that death itself is still something to be feared, but that the prospect of death is valuable in some way. And I'll come back to all of these, but maybe that aggregated welfare doesn't matter much if what you think is valuable about what we're doing as humans is like the creation of great works, of culture, of art, of philosophy. Then maybe it doesn't matter very much how long the average person lives, how healthy they are. And then we may choose unwisely. Like there's an element of caution about people's ability to make these kinds of choices, that if we had the option of continuing to live for a very long time, we sort of wouldn't be able to resist. We wouldn't be able to listen to any wiser counsel faced with like our impending demise. So I am inclined to try to explain these differences. Like, I think part of this revealing the positions that we're coming from is trying to understand why people end up at these different places, or how they would elaborate on the arguments. And so mortalists, as I've been reading more about this, there's this idea of bad health, which I've already talked about, that I think this is just a thing that mortalists and immortalists can agree on. Like, we don't want to extend bad health. This just seems like a bad idea, broadly speaking. There's this idea of either boredom or boring people. So I've heard both of these kind of ideas. One is that as you repeat more and more things, you become less interested in them, or maybe, I'm not very sympathetic to this, but maybe that most people don't have the capacity to engage deeply enough with life, or that they're not put in a position to by society, that like their opportunities are not very great. There's this idea of exhausting the things that the world has to offer, or the idea of exhausting what the self has to offer. And so sort of the well runs dry here. We've opted into eternal life and then find out that it was not all it was cracked up to be. So I think there are some immortalists, I'm doing this sort of as a call and response, and it's a little bit unfair to the mortalists because I'm letting the immortalists have the last word, but you guys will have the last word when you ask questions or when we talk later. I think the immortalist response here is to, or the view that's more natural, is to say that we expect the world to be radically expanded in the future, for people's opportunities to be radically expanded, for the kinds of art and science and culture and personal experience that are available in the future to be just radically wider than they are now. And you can compare historically between our experiences and early experiences of humans. Just the opportunities available can really change the experience of what it is to be a human and to make choices. The second thing here, this idea of culture making, that we have created a culture, we live in a world that's radically different from how humans evolved. And we've created culture to cope with this. Like, this is like the water that we swim in. It is what informs all of the choices you make and the way you view the world, and gives you sort of like a structure or a ladder to, people aren't inventing life for themselves. Like, modern life isn't invented by each individual. It's built on this culture that we've built up. And so I think there's a future project, which I'm excited about, which is culture making for people who live for a much longer time. Like, how do you structure a life if it could last thousands of years? I think that I'm just not pessimistic enough about human culture to think that it won't expand into that space, that it won't like be flexible enough. Like, I just think humans, especially in groups and especially when they're thinking carefully, are extraordinarily adaptable, that we can sort of rise to this challenge of building a culture that can support radically longer life. There's this idea of deep personal history, so I think that I originally called this the vampire, but vampires have sort of a bad rap in fiction. But the idea of someone who has lived personally through huge amounts of history. So like, you have lived through the Renaissance, and you've lived through the scientific revolution, and you've seen the rise and fall of countries and empires. Like, I want to talk to that person. Like, I want to know what their what their view of the world is when we're sort of glimpsing in this dim kind of way the recordings of people who lived through these times. So I think the potential for having deep personal history that's integrated with a personal history that's integrated with our cultural history, or that's even integrated with our geological or physical history, is a really interesting prospect. These last two I'll sort of skim over quickly. There's this idea of that maybe in the future we'll have much expanded freedom, that maybe the things that strike people as boring about today's world, you have the need to work, like there are a lot of psychological interpersonal problems that we don't understand well and that you have to grapple with and never come to terms with. And I think it's reasonable, it's like far from sure, but reasonable to expect that the problems of future people will be very different from ours. And in particular, that as technology becomes more productive, the kind of work that we do now is not likely to persist in the future, just the same way most of us aren't farmers. And then there's the idea of enhancement. So if humans as currently configured are not up to living in a much more temporally extended world, then maybe we'll change ourselves in the way we've changed ourselves with our tools over time. And it's easy to imagine this, humans being aided by technology or humans changing themselves through technology. So changing your brain to have more room for additional experience, to have better recall of things, to have worse recall of things in some cases, to see the novelty and freshness of experience again each time we have it, to avoid that sort of boredom or ennui. But I think both of those are like pretty questionable. I feel a lot better about the first three. Those seem like things that you can just look at human history already and see having happened. So there's this question of, does the prospect of death benefit us? And in a talk yesterday, we heard Simone de Beauvoir and Bernard Williams. Leon Kass also, I think, does a good job with this, talking about how having death looming in the future is a benefit to us now. So there's this idea that maybe we wouldn't be as serious and aspirational about our lives if we didn't have this, if the Reaper wasn't coming, that we wouldn't be motivated to get out of bed in the morning or to go do things if death wasn't looming. There's an idea of contrast, so that a flower would be less beautiful if it were permanent, and that its impermanence is like an intrinsic part of its beauty. Opportunity for virtue. So this is a little different. So Leon Kass was talking about the opportunity of either sacrificing your time for a project or a person. So you have a limited amount of time in your life. You're going to give these years or these weeks or these months or these decades to your kids or to a particular work of art that you're working on. Or that you might sacrifice your life, that you might, throw yourself in front of the bullet and give up all of those years you had ahead of you, and that these could be immensely virtuous moments that could just make a whole life. So I think the first one of those is pretty reasonable. Like if we had a much greater store of years ahead of us, giving a few decades to some project doesn't seem like a very virtuous sacrifice. But if we had thousands of years stretching ahead of us and we still threw ourselves in front of a bullet, that's a kind of virtue that we've just never seen before. Like the giving up 10,000 years of life ahead of you in order to do something you believe in. No one has ever had that opportunity. So I don't know, maybe it's expanded virtue, opportunity. And then there's this idea of meaning, which honestly I'm like still trying to figure out what people are talking about here. The idea that death gives life meaning, I think it's a real thing. I don't think that people don't know what they're talking about. I just don't know what they're talking about. I haven't gotten there yet. So I have a small thought experiment about the prospect of death. So let's say all of us in this room, when we're lying on our deathbeds in the future, an angel comes down and grants us immortal life. Then there's this question of whether we need to, if we believe in these benefits of mortality, whether we need to look back over our lives and devalue everything we've done and say, well, now that I'm immortal, those relationships I had, those things that I did and said, like this time at this conference, none of that matters because I thought I had a finite, I thought I had my 3 score and 10, and Now I don't, so none of it mattered at all. I find that sort of implausible. And what I take from that is that if the prospect of death benefits us, then it's a psychological benefit. It's like the belief that death is coming for us, and not like the real truth out there in the world that we are essentially mortal in some way. And so I think that bringing that down to a psychological question and a cultural question means that there may be variance among people, like that different people have different reactions to the belief that death is coming for them. And also that our culture could greatly influence how the prospect of death affects us, because it is like mediated by our experience of it. So I have some sort of glib responses to whether the prospect of death benefits us, because I'm not trying to make good philosophical arguments here, but just explain like the emotional position that an immortalist might be in. A few responses might be that death isn't really my day-to-day motivator. It's not the thing that I'm thinking about when I come in to get a coffee, or when I come in to watch a talk, or when I spend time with friends and family, or with doing anything I enjoy. Maybe death is somehow lurking in my subconscious and I can't access that, but I'm sort of skeptical. Also doesn't seem present in my love or experience of beauty. Maybe that's because I'm a shallow appreciator of beauty or love, but it's just not something that I've felt. I think that some virtues are not necessarily worth the cost, that there's this trade-off. So the virtue of being able to give of your finite span of years might be sort of like the virtue of being able to, so if you have a nurse in a hospital who treats patients but will contract the disease that they have and then die. That's virtuous, but I'd rather spare the nurse that situation than say, oh, well, we shouldn't figure out how to keep the nurse safe, because how can we deprive the nurse of that virtue? And then just consider finding another source of meaning. Like if death was no longer an available source of meaning, and I think people who lean on who lean to the atheist side on this are already familiar with this sort of situation. That sometimes the things that you thought gave life meaning don't turn out to appear in the world, or may not appear in the world in the future. But again, I think humans and human culture we're flexible, we're adaptable. So I'm not really worried about future people not being up to the challenge of finding meaning in other places. So I think this last question of whether we're likely to choose unwisely is in a way the immortalist's secret weapon. Like, all we're doing here is offering people a choice. There's not a prospect of forcing everyone to live forever. So don't worry if you don't want to. You don't have to. But it's also a weakness because people don't always choose well and wisely, and especially under social or cultural pressure, people sometimes don't choose well and wisely. So I think that if the technology becomes available to radically extend life, there will be a really, really important cultural project of figuring out what the role of death in the world is now that it's optional. And I think that's quite an interesting question, like whether there are ways of choosing to die, or choosing as a society to incorporate death into our practices. Like, what does that fit? How does it fit into the human experience to choose a time and manner of death? And I think that it's a question that shouldn't be ignored, shouldn't be punted off to the future. It's something that we should talk about now. And so while I've sort of presented an immortalist side of things, like a picture of why I think the things I do really think that we need to continue having this conversation. One of the reasons that I want to try to share this perspective more fully and avoid, me sitting in my corner saying, "Oh, Leon Kass, what a fool, or what a villain for wanting people to die," and him sitting in the corner and saying, "Oh, this if he had heard of me, this person thinks that life is so great and that everyone should have long and healthy lives." That we need to share these roots of our experiences and these roots of our beliefs in order to make progress on these questions. I think I will stop there. So thank you.
So this is a question coming from a card-carrying mortalist. is I find one of the main things that draws me to mortalism is something you didn't really touch on. And that is our nature is deeply social beings. It's connected with the idea of meaning, but it's not that death is giving us meaning necessarily, but that our attachments give us meaning, the surrounding world give us meaning. And so I think this is worrying for a mortalist in two main respects, which are interconnected. One is that if I just think about the prospect of continuing, it can be very alienating because I have no sense of what this surrounding world in the future is like, or if I'll be able to get meaning from it. Maybe I will, but the prospect is very alienating. And the second point is that it's very hard to think about these things in abstraction from thinking about what other people will live on. It's terrifying enough, horrifying enough to think that many of the people I love most will die before I will, and then I'll be living on and missing them. And if I think about the prospect of living on for thousands and thousands of years without these people, it seems to me completely horrifying. I can't imagine my life like this.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. I think it's one of those things that like, I'm glad you bring this up because I do want to better understand the motivation or the anxiety over this prospect. I think everything you said is true. I think that it's possible that the future will be immensely alienating. Like, as an avid science fiction reader, I've seen some pretty alienating looking visions of the future. And those are generated by people who are writing today. There's nothing near as strange as real life. Yeah, I think that I don't have an answer besides that it seems to me that having a choice in the matter makes a big difference. That if you find yourself in a world that's so alienating you don't want to continue in it, you may change yourself so much that your personal identity is no longer really preserved. And that's like a kind of death, maybe. And then followed by fitting in the world. Or you may just choose to end your life altogether, that like your story's done. The context is gone, the relationships are gone, all of these projects. So Bernard Williams talked about this a little bit. I'm very sympathetic to that. I tend to like new projects, but yeah, so I don't have a good answer. I think that's a good point.
Thank you. That was very interesting, thank you. Just a small point, Leon Kass is a good friend of mine. When he was writing that article, his wife was dying, and his wife was the love of his life. And he was really reflecting on the connection between love and death, which is a long-standing romantic theme. I express this by saying that love is a relation between dying things. And I think that if you reflect on that, if that were true, if love was actually made possible by a recognition of death in the other, and that you are part of that other through your mutual postponing of it, or your mutual protection of each other against it, or just the acknowledgement of your finitude, then I think that does change things roughly in the direction that Andrew was just saying, I think. Small point.
Yeah, I'll have to reflect on that. And also, I mean, this highlights a way in which I'm uniquely unqualified to give this talk. My experience of death in my life is minimal.
Where it will come.
That's what I've heard. It doesn't sound great. I have one question back for you. Do you think the prospect of that you and your beloved would die at the eventual heat death of the universe, do you think that would serve the same purpose, or is that too far away?
It's too far away.
Okay, so we need closer. That's helpful.
Yes. I mean, you yourself admitted this when you recognized that infinity is a small thing compared with a big number.
Yeah.
Thank you for the very stimulating talk, Daniel, but I'm afraid I'm also coming from the mortalist camp.
Yeah.
But I just make this is just one little reflection. I mean, given that perhaps we can't make a very clear distinction between humans and animals, at least I feel that's the case, perhaps I think maybe with Derrida rather than Heidegger on that, would you also extend this prospect of immortality to all the animals on the earth?
Oh, so I'm actually really interested in animal welfare. I think there's a lot of moral uncertainty about what aspects of animal experience matter. Like, some people disagree about whether they feel pains or pleasures. It's unclear what kinds of life projects animals are embarking on that might be morally relevant. I think that in the face of that kind of uncertainty, you sort of have to hedge your bets. I would hate to look back on us now and find out that we were committing these great misdeeds against morally relevant beings. So I'm very supportive of animal welfare, broadly speaking. Life extension, I don't think, so something that maybe I should have clarified in the talk, I think that this is very, very far from any argument that life extension should be prioritized over many other things that we're doing. So it's hard for me to imagine how far down the list of priorities extending animal life falls. But I think it's pretty nearby to extending human life in this way. Like this is like an expensive way of doing good in the world, as far as I can tell, is like extending human life. And I think extending animal life would probably be good, but expensive and maybe a project for later.
So thanks for a great talk. It sparked a number of thoughts. So let me see if I can kind of put them in a kind of eloquent and communicative way. If I understood correctly, you made the point that were we to live our lives until the point at our deathbed where we were offered immortality, that we would have to revise the meaning of certain events in our life because that meaning was there because we were fearing death. And you said it was psychological and thus irrelevant. But I think actually that argument is irrelevant because even if we would be offered immortality on our deathbed, that wouldn't change anything about what happened before. That's more of a point, and I'd be interested to hear your take on that. Also, in Holland, there's been a lot of discussion about euthanasia because it's allowed. And actually, I think what's often seen is that people might, in the best time of their lives, be able to specify a point at which they would like to be euthanized. But that actually, if you come closer and closer to that point, people change their opinion because it's all relative. And so what Andrew said about coming to the point where all your loved ones die, and then you said, well, you can make the choice to then die yourself. I think that actually is a much more complex case than you might sketch here, is that, yes, you have the choice, but I think the choice actually poses more problems than it's actually I don't actually see that as a solution to anything.
Yeah, so let me do those in order.
Yeah.
On the deathbed thought experiment, I think actually we're more in agreement, and maybe I haven't communicated it clearly. The point I was trying to make there was that thinking about that shows that it's not the truth of our mortality that like, assuming that there are benefits from mortality, they're not benefits from like the essential truth of mortality, but just from the belief in mortality. So if humans were mistaken in thinking that they were going to die, then we would get those same benefits that they were talking about. And so for me, this moves it from some like essential thing into, like, maybe if you thought that mortality was such a fundamental part of the human condition that that changing it would not preserve the things we value. It moves it from that sort of like fundamental realm into something that we can actually affect. So when something is a psychological issue or a cultural issue, and by issue I don't mean that those are bad things, they're just like within psychology or within culture, within the way people react to different ideas, they're much more accessible. Like, we can touch them and interact with them and understand why these ideas affect people the way they do, and create culture that helps people come to terms with or to reinterpret or re-understand those situations. I'm not sure I've made this more clear. On the second point, yeah, I think that the question of how people interact with voluntary death is like really fascinating to me, and is not something that you can just put up some kind of like economic style rational human and claim that this is how people will behave. I think that's totally unrealistic. I think that we don't have much experience yet with voluntary death, but I've been quite encouraged by what I have seen. Although in most cases that has to do with terminal illness, so like has to do with choosing how to die when you have Alzheimer's, which is a very different situation from choosing to die like in the bloom of health. I agree that it's complicated. I think that maybe I am being a bit glib by saying that we're just offering people a choice and they can take whatever they want from it.
Well, in Holland, you now get cases also of actually people in the bloom of their health, but they are suffering, for instance, so much from tinnitus that they still feel that life is unbearable and choose to die. I mean, I guess suicide immediately comes in also because it is basically suicide, but in a more kind of humane way, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, if someone was suffering from tinnitus and claimed to me that it was making their life not worth living, I think it's worth trying to be really sure when you're interacting with someone who thinks their life isn't worth living, that they're like considering this from all the angles that they could. But ultimately, I mean, it's their life and not mine. I would feel pretty presumptuous claiming to know better than they did once I was satisfied that they'd investigated and looked into it. But yeah, maybe in the future people will say like, oh well, this is bad enough that I'm not interested in continuing.
Thanks, Daniel. I have a comment and then a question. You said that death isn't your day-to-day motivator, but it made you fly halfway around the world and give a talk on death. So it seems that you are driven by death much more than the mortalist, because you always have the prospect of death. So even as an immortalist, death is still there, isn't it? And as you worked at Google, you're probably very aware of Ray Kurzweil. And I was wondering if you could say something on uploading, which you don't like, but to simplify it, if you think it's possible. And don't you think, but you know, what would happen if somebody pulled the plug? I mean, machines have a lifespan. They die also. There isn't. I mean, what you would do is, if you view that as a view of Gnosticism, you would just replace one prison of the flesh with another.
Yeah. I think these are good points. I have a counter comment, which is that the actual motivation for me to fly out here and be here is like this. Yeah. It's not like this. Like, I think we could have found a lot of things to talk about. Death happens to be, or ephemerality happens to be a pretty nice topic, but I'm more motivated by the life here than. But on the uploading question, so first of all, I think that it would be presumptuous to say, like, I'm not highly confident about like functional theories of mind, about the preservation of identity through radical changes in media. I haven't seen the evidence that could lead anyone to be that confident about those things. But I agree with you that if it were possible, then you would be trading one physical body for another physical body. It would just be a physical body with more convenient properties in a lot of ways. So like this stuff was not really made to be aftermarket modified or to be repaired when it's breaking down. It was made for passing on the genes. So I think that it's true that you're not transcending to some like non-material plane.
I think Kurzweil believes that. He will actually transcend.
Yeah, I can't really speak to Kurzweil's beliefs. I have to say that I don't really understand his beliefs that well.
Google believes in him, though. And then there's, of course, all of the ethical and political problems that would come if you really.
Yeah, Google's a big place. I'm sure there's a wide diversity of opinions.
Fun?
Oh, I'm sure there's a wide diversity of opinions.
I really enjoyed that. I sympathise with your youthful naivety. I think it's quite
exactly.
It's very inspiring. I really enjoyed it. I just wonder whether, though, the distinction between the immortalist and the mortalist is just an unnecessary complication for you. Given that you said we're not really talking about immortality, we're talking about life extension. Life extension is something that we all buy into already. Every time you go to the doctor or you eat a healthy diet, we've already bought into that. So it seems to me that we really need this distinction between the two, unless you're not really coming clean with us, and that you really are talking about immortality till the death of the universe. So it seems to me
Wait, immortality till the death of the universe is like longer mortality, right?
Well, what I mean is, till there's no possibility of sustaining any form of life. So it seems to me that we don't really need this distinction between it. We're all, we're either talking about immortality, or if it's life extension, well, I think everyone's already bought into that. So that was my only sort of.
Yeah. So I think you may be right. This distinction really is my attempt to come clean, because I think that the argument that everyone already accepts life extension, therefore obviously accept radical life extension, is a little bit too smooth. Like, I don't think that's really how people think about it. I think there really are two different experiences of life extension. And the first one corresponds more to not dying from what your grandfather died of. And the second one, I mean, is like what we were talking about, where age and length of life passes over the horizon, where for the way we experience it, it might as well be immortality. And like, that's something I'd be really happy to talk about. If people think that that psychological distinction is not particularly important, and that there really is an idea of, well, so honestly, I'm still confused about the idea of immortality that ends at some point that you're talking about.
Well, no, I thought you made that. I thought you made the distinction at the beginning and said, well, I'm not really talking about immortality, I'm talking about life extension. That's what we're talking about. And so then my thought was, well, I think we've all bought into that. I mean, perhaps you're correct. There's a nuance there between how much life extension. But I think we've all bought into some form of life extension. We already do live longer than people did.
Yeah,
in history. So that's already happened. And so I think we've already, every time you choose to eat a salad instead of something, there's a sense of, having bought into that, which is not the same as buying into the idea of not dying.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. I'm very open to the idea that this is not the clearest way of presenting it. It was an attempt to avoid like the sort of glib move of saying, well, you already eat a salad, why not replace yourself with a robot? Which I think is not something many people go for. But yeah, I totally see your point. I think it's a good point.
So ultimately, is that? I mean, I don't know, because I've only just met you, so I don't know what. When you write about this, when you think about this, is it life extension, thinking of hundreds of years and thousands of years, or is it the idea of just living?
Oh, I'm thinking of, life extension until you die from an accident, or until you die from an accident that makes the human race extinct, or until the universe runs out of steam. I think those should be the options.
Oh, thank you for a beautiful talk. I'm one of those characters who's responsible for life extension, at least in principle anyway, as a doctor. And two things that strike me. One is, first of all, there is no right time to die if you're in good health. That's sure Nietzsche's question, when is the right time to die? It seems to me that isn't a question we've ever addressed. Because there's always potential, and Timothy Chappell points this out in response to Bernard Williams, there's always potential for new projects and so on and so forth. Bernard Williams' other point, that if we live long enough, we'll actually have died because we will have ceased to have any kind of connection with our earlier selves. I think that's true of a life of normal duration. I am a remote descendant of the 4-year-old I once was. What makes me actually seriously connect with that character is there is an audit trail. So that's the answer, in a sense, to the shipper thesis question, that, everything's changed, but there is an audit trail linking those things. So I don't buy either of, certainly the second, Bernard Williams' second argument, that if you live for 1,000 years, you've actually effectively died, because there is that continuity.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thanks for pointing that out. Yeah, I think that this is like, I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one point to your counter-argument to the moralists, that you have this choice of when you die. I think you've given us an intolerable burden. We've got enough free choice, it's hell as it is, but the idea that you then have to go on and choose when you die, and as Ray said, the fact is that if you've got tinnitus, who knows in this infinite future that you won't find a cure for it. Why give us this terrible burden?
That's a really interesting perspective that I'm going to have to try to understand more deeply. It doesn't feel like a terrible burden to me, so I need to I feel like we should connect more and figure out why does it feel this way? Because I feel like until people who are naturally inclined towards life extension understand why to some people it feels like a terrible burden, it's going to be difficult to have the conversation clearly.
I don't mean the burden of immortality, I mean the burden
of
choice.
The burden of choice. Yeah, absolutely. No, I see what you're saying, but I don't understand it yet. So maybe we'll get there.
It feels like this is a room full of people who have experienced a certain kind of mortality. And I wonder to what extent you think any of the people in this room can expect to experience the kind of radical change that you've been describing. By which I suppose I mean we all might have a level of uncomfortableness dealing with the ideas of mortality as you describe them. But will the people who really experience that kind of radical change feel those things?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I always have difficulty with this because it's like predicting when these kinds of things are going to be possible, I think is just not something that you can do with much precision. Like things could go really well and really quickly, and in 20 years we're faced with this choice. Or things could, as they so often do, turn out to be much more complicated than they look at first, and 200 years from now, our descendants are thinking about this. But I think there's a real prospect that we in this room will have to deal with some form of this choice. If it's not until 200 years from now, maybe there will be much more time for more conversations to happen, or for other kinds of changes in society that will prepare people for this kind of transformation or this kind of choice. But I'm not really sure.
Yeah. So I just want to get clear. You professed or feigned a misunderstanding about something a few times, and I don't think you really misunderstand it. So I want to be clear. Would you agree that limitations are what make decisions and actions matter? That it's because there's something at stake that's beyond my control that what I do matters in an important way. Would you agree with that proposal?
So I agree that having something at stake is what makes decisions. Like otherwise, and maybe that's what you mean by decisions that matter.
Yeah.
You were also talking about limitations, and I think that there's something there about. Maybe you can elaborate more.
Well, I think that's the basic insight behind a lot of the mortalist position that you're dismissing, and then the disagreement becomes what kind of limitations, what kind of constraints could we lift without wiping away all of the things that make life matter to us. I think that's what the argument's really about. And then I'd like to hear. So you're proposing. Look, here's one of the things that limits us is the length of life, and you're saying that one we could just take that one away, and we'd still be okay. There would still be enough other things that make life matter. And I don't know if that's wrong. I don't know if that's right. I'd like to hear an argument. And so the mortalists, for all the failings, they're at least addressing that question. They're trying to offer an argument to the effect that this is one of the limitations that we can't remove without the whole house of cards tumbling down. And what I've heard from you so far is just, well, don't worry, it's going to be okay. And I'd just like to hear more about that. You might be right. I would certainly like to live a lot longer than I think I'm going to. But I haven't heard anything yet to convince me that this is one of the things that we ought to just be willing to throw out.
Yeah. And I think there's this. So one of the things you said earlier was that having something at stake is what makes decisions matter. And then you're also talking about limitations on our options, that somehow makes things matter. The first one I'm very on board with. It's easy for me to understand. The second one I feel like I'm still grappling with. And I think you're right. It's something that I've encountered a lot in reading about this. This idea that, well, because our natural lifespans are like uniquely one of the things that our choices don't affect as much as we would like in terms of consequences, but they are like a deep limitation on the options available to us. I just have to confess that I don't feel like I understand yet the viewpoint that says that limitations on choices make them more meaningful, or like maybe they make them more tolerable, and I can get on board with that. But maybe you can help me understand this. I think it's really a case of like cultural difficulty of like coming from a very different place and trying to explain these hard to explain things to each other. And so part of the reason I'm glad I'm here is because I get an opportunity to grill people and figure out what's going on there. So that's not a satisfying answer. I don't have one.